On the morning following Anderson's move to Sumter, Francis Pickens was furious and out for revenge. He ordered that all federal property be taken by state troops. These included Fort Moultrie, Fort Pinckney, the Customs House, Post Office, and the Arsenal. By the end of December, the only federal property still in Union hands in South Carolina was Fort Sumter. It was felt by Jefferson Davis and R.M.T. Hunter as they left President Buchanan on the 27th that they had convinced him that Anderson should be ordered to leave Fort Sumter. But they did not take into account the cabinet. Buchanan relied heavily on the advice of his cabinet, and it was no longer split over the North-South issue, as by then most of the Southern leaders had resigned. Those few from the South that did remain made it clear that they felt Anderson should be withdrawn, not only from Sumter but also from Charleston, to prevent a civil war. After much angry debate, Secretary of State Stanton said in a powerful voice that if the President of the United States would issue the kind of order that the gentlemen from the South are talking about, then he would be guilty of the worst kind of treason. The cabinet became quiet at this statement. They all looked at Buchanan, who had raised his hands in the air, saying, "Oh, no, not so bad as that, my friend, not so bad as that." Buchanan was filled with regret about the position in which he had been placed. Overnight, the status quo had changed to the point where one side or the other had to back down. If not, it could mean war. There was also one other thing that Buchanan had to take into account. In the wings stood President-elect Abraham Lincoln, who quietly made it clear to anyone who asked that he would take back any federal property that Buchanan might give away. Letters and telegrams were exchanged between Washington and Charleston, but no solution could be seen to be found. Slowly, both sides were being drawn towards war, which no one North or South seemed forthright enough to stop. Lieutenant General Winfield Scott, the aging Commander-in-Chief of the Federal Army, wrote to the President on the 30th December, "Will the President permit General Scott, without reference to the War Department and otherwise as secretly as possible, to send 250 recruits from New York Harbor to reinforce Fort Sumter, together with some extra muskets or rifles, ammunition, and subsistence stores?" On receipt of this note from General Scott, President Buchanan realized that if he did decide to hold on to Fort Sumter, he and his government better prepare themselves to fight. Scott, he realized, wanted to handle the matter personally without reference to the War Department because, as everybody was aware, with so many Southern sympathizers in Washington, information about any move being planned in the White House or in the War Department would be on Governor Pickens' desk within 48 hours. Buchanan was now influenced by a much more pro-Union cabinet, and he was pressed to allow General Scott to reinforce Anderson's command as he requested. Buchanan, who was unable as he had hoped to remain sitting on the fence until he retired, reluctantly sent the following order to Scott, telling him to immediately move to put reinforcements into Fort Sumter. As the last few days of December passed and no attack came, Anderson and his men took account of their new surroundings. Captain Foster found plenty of work for everybody, including the loyal workmen that had been allowed to stay. They were the first volunteers for the Union cause, but they failed to reap the benefits of their enlistment, as they were never mustered in. However, they, like everybody else, were kept working, for at the time of Anderson's occupation, Fort Sumter was far from finished. Everywhere inside there were building materials, guns, carriages, shot, shell, derricks, timbers, blocks and tackle, and coils of rope. Few of the guns were mounted, and those that were mainly on the lowest tier. The second tier was nowhere near completed, which meant the men could only mount guns on the first and third tiers, which would be very difficult, some of the cannons weighing as much as 15,000 pounds. Even though the full complement of cannons had not been delivered before Anderson's occupation, he was satisfied that there was enough already in the fort for his small garrison to man. Anderson was not worried at first about being attacked by artillery fire from the coast, as the heavy guns in Fort Moultrie had been spiked and the carriages burnt. It would take the South Carolinian forces a considerable amount of time to remount them, while preparing other batteries to begin a substantial bombardment. His first concern was to defend the fort from a possible assault by militia sent out by boat, probably at night. Captain James Chester wrote, "The most likely place to land was the wharf, a stone structure in front of the main entrance. Then an assaulting column might be formed and the main gate stormed, while the bulk of the garrison was defending the embrasures. To checkmate any such attempt, a means of blowing the wharf out of existence was devised. 2 5-gallon demijohns filled with powder were planted as mines, well under the wharf pavement, in such a way as to ensure the total demolition of the structure by their explosion." Another place offering special advantages to a storming party was the Esplanade. This was a broad promenade extending the whole length of the gorge wall on the outside, and paved with immense blocks of dressed granite. As Fort Sumter was not designed to resist attack by storm, the Esplanade was unswept by any fire. To remedy this defect, stone fugassa was resorted to. To the uninitiated, the fugassa looked like a harmless pile of stone resting against the scarp wall, but they were mines of the deadliest kind. In addition, 2 8-inch seacoast howitzers were mounted on their upper carriages only, and placed in front of the main entrance, pointing to the right and left so as to sweep the Esplanade. Many other creative methods of defense were improvised to protect blind spots on the outside of the fort, including hand grenades of all sizes made from shells, which were left behind the parapet under cover at short intervals wherever it was thought they might be useful. One last contrivance worth a mention was the flying fugassa, or bursting barrel. Captain Chester said of this, "The flying fugassa was an ordinary cask or barrel filled with broken stones, and having in its center a canister of powder sufficient to burst the barrel and scatter its contents with considerable force. When it became known in the fort that one of these barrels was about to be fired as an experiment, the novelty of the thing attracted most of the men to the place, and the little crowd attracted the attention of the enemy. When everything was ready, the barrel was allowed to roll over the parapet, and an instant afterward a terrific explosion took place. The stones were thrown in every direction, and the surface of the water was lashed into foam for a considerable distance. The effect as seen by the secessionists must have appeared greater than it did to us, although we thought it quite satisfactory." A Charleston newspaper called it an infernal machine, and its effect as simply terrific. To those who thought they might have to attack the fort one day, the experiment must have appeared simply terrifying. Although in the fort there were more than enough guns of various types, they had no mortars. To substitute for this, a huge 10-inch Columbiad was mounted on the parade ground. Next to this, some smaller 8-inch guns were partly buried at acute angles facing targets on the shore. The 10-inch Columbiad was able to fire a shot weighing 128 pounds by an 18-pound charge of powder. It was bigger than anything the Confederates had, and it would be able to do immense damage if employed. Anderson had it placed so that it could be fired at Charleston. Once the gun was in position, some of the officers wanted to try it out to see how it would work. Captain Chester wrote of this experiment, "So one afternoon the gun was loaded with a blind shell and what was considered a very small charge of powder. The regulation charge for the gun, as a gun, was 18 pounds. On this occasion, 2 pounds only were used. It was not expected that the shell would be thrown much over 1,000 yards, and as the bay was clear, no danger was anticipated." Everything being in readiness, the gun was fired, and the eyes of the garrison followed the shell as it described its graceful curve in the direction of the city. By the time it reached the summit of its trajectory, The fact that the charge used was not a very small one for the gun when fired as a mortar became painfully apparent to every observer, and fears were entertained by some that the shell would reach the city, or at least the shipping near the wharves. But fortunately it fell short and did no damage beyond scaring the secessionist guard boat, then leaving the wharf for her nightly post of observation. The guard boat put back, and Sumter was visited by a flag of truce to find out the meaning of our performance. It was a habit of both sides to practice firing their guns every now and then, and as we have seen, sometimes mistakes were made. The South Carolinians nicked the corner of Sumter on one occasion when a badly aimed shot was fired. Yet every time something went amiss, apologies were sent under the flag of truce, and pleasantries were exchanged, as if those taking part were just playing a harmless game. Since Anderson's occupation of the fort, several aides had been sent by Governor Pickens demanding that the major should return to Fort Moultrie. His reply was that he was a Southern man, but that he'd been assigned to the defense of Charleston Harbor, and he intended to defend it. Days passed quickly as the soldiers and workmen mounted guns, bricked up embrasures, and reinforced the main gate by building a substantial brick wall behind it. This was felt necessary, as heavy fire directed at the gate could have demolished it in a few minutes, and a substantial force waiting outside would have been able to overpower the small garrison. On the 3rd January 1861, Anderson sent a message to the War Department in Washington reporting that he and his men were in good shape. He believed that he could hold the fort against any force likely to be brought against him, and "I shall not ask for any increase in my command, because I do not know what the ulterior views of the government are." He went on to explain that the South Carolina authorities were busy putting batteries in position to sweep the harbor entrance. "We are now, or soon will be, cut off from all communication, unless by means of a powerful fleet which shall have the ability to carry the batteries at the mouth of the harbor." Anderson's message reached Washington just after the merchant steamer, the Star of the West, arranged by General Scott, had sailed for Charleston, loaded with 200 recruits, food, and ammunition. The War Department hastily drew up a message and sent it to Anderson, advising him of the reinforcements and broadening his powers of authority. Should a fire likely to prove injurious be opened upon any vessel bringing up reinforcements or supplies, or upon towboats within the reach of your guns, they may be employed to silence such fire, and you may act in a like manner in case a fire is opened on Fort Sumter itself. This message never reached Anderson. It was intercepted by Governor Pickens' agents, so the major had no idea that a relief expedition was on its way, or of the new authority that had been given him. General Scott had made every effort to keep the sailing of the Star of the West a secret, but news of the venture inevitably leaked out, and on 8th January 1861, Governor Pickens of South Carolina received a telegram from a sympathizer in Washington advising him that troops were on the way. Major Anderson found out in a much more absurd fashion about the expedition that was coming down to reinforce him. He read about it in a Southern newspaper. Although the garrison were not allowed to receive any large supplies, they were permitted by the South Carolina authorities to receive fresh beef and vegetables, plus mail and newspapers on a regular basis. Although Anderson wasn't to know how much truth there might be in the newspaper story, later that day it was noticed from Sumter that there was a flurry of signals passing between the outlying batteries and Charleston. Speculation started to run high among Anderson's officers and men that help might be on its way. On the Star of the West, Lieutenant Charles R. Woods of the 9th U.S. Infantry, commanding the reinforcements for Sumter, was informed by the captain that they would reach Charleston that evening after nightfall. Woods immediately had his men issued with arms and ammunition in the hope that he might make his transfer to Fort Sumter that night, under the shadow of darkness, hopefully unseen from the shore. It was just before midnight when the ship finally arrived off the bar of Charleston Harbor. There was not a light to be seen except for one lone beacon on Fort Sumter. The captain ordered that the engines should be stopped and the steamer drifted on the tide, while the officers decided what was their best course of action. They concluded it might be too dangerous to make an attempt at entering the harbor in the dark, so they would try at first light when the main ship channel buoys could be clearly seen. In the meantime, the men were told to try to get some sleep. At the crack of dawn, the captain was up and about his duties, examining the coast at great length with his spyglass, comparing what he saw with his chart. When Lieutenant Woods joined him, the captain explained to the young officer that they were about 5 miles from the entrance to Charleston Harbor, and pointed out the channel, marked with buoys, that they would have to follow. The captain, satisfied that his ship was ready, and seeing that Woods' men were safely under cover, he ordered that the engines be started. Soon the huge wheels on her side started to turn, and the Star of the West slowly began to make way, her paddles dipping into the water, driving the ship forward at an ever-increasing rate. They steamed along the main ship channel towards the mile-wide entrance to Charleston Harbor. It was the captain's intention to enter the harbor mouth on the southern side, as near to Cummings Point as possible. He would then keep his ship at the longest range from any guns that might have been remounted in Fort Moultrie, which was on the northern jaw of the harbor. The captain was, of course, completely unaware of the new hidden batteries that had been placed on Morris Island at Cummings Point, right on the harbor mouth itself. As the Star of the West approached the bar, the captain stood by his helmsman, spyglass to his eye, as he swept the coastline for any hidden dangers. All was still quiet in the half-light of dawn, except for the pounding of the ship's engines and the splashing her paddles made as they dug deep into the water, driving the steamer forward. "Sir, there's a ship in the harbor mouth," shouted a lookout from the rigging. Lieutenant Woods was now back by the captain's side. "I see it, sir. Look, it's signaling." The Secession Guard steamer that was sailing through the harbor mouth hoisted red and blue lights and waited patiently for the Star of the West to reply. The captain, not knowing the correct response, decided to make none at all. Everyone on board was now aware that any chance they had of taking the secessionists by surprise had now gone. The guard steamer waited for some minutes for a reply to her signal before, at last, she turned away at full speed back towards Charleston, firing rockets as a warning of the unidentified ship's approach. As the Star of the West neared Cummings Point, a lookout spotted a palmetto flag flying on the shore. This, the captain knew, was the adopted flag of the independent nation of South Carolina. But even with the aid of his spyglass, he could not see any batteries near it. He ordered that the United States flag should be hoisted as he rounded the point. He also sent below, for safety's sake, the troops that had come up on deck to see what was happening. Captain Abner Doubleday and most of the garrison of Sumter were on the parapet watching out to sea. Doubleday had seen the rockets fired by the guard steamer as it returned at high speed into the harbor, followed soon after by another steamer which came into view as it rounded the point. He could see she was flying the national flag. The men wondered if they were to be reinforced after all, or perhaps they were to be withdrawn from the harbor. Doubleday rushed down to report to Major Anderson, and he immediately ordered that the drummers beat the long roll. Gunners ran to their stations at the barbettes, while Anderson went up to the parapet with Doubleday to watch the Star of the West as she still approached at full speed. On Morris Island, cadets from the Citadel, the South Carolina Military College, stood by their guns watching the unidentified steamer following the guard boat into the harbor. They were young men, full of excitement and ready for action as they waited impatiently for orders from their officers to open fire. However, their officers, who were standing in a group watching the steamer, were being cautious. They didn't want to fire on a friendly ship by mistake. It could, after all, be a ship of a different nationality that didn't know the signal. They finally sprung to life when the ship turned into the harbor mouth, unfurling the United States flag. A young gunner was given the privilege of firing a warning shot across the steamer's bow. He gripped the lanyard tightly in his hand and, at his officer's command, jerked it hard. There was a flash and a thunderous report as the gun jumped backwards with the force of the charge. The cadets had fired a solid shot at far too high an elevation to be a threat. The Star of the West raised a larger flag and kept steaming toward Sumter. Major Anderson, who was watching the steamer approach, heard a sound like dull thunder, which he knew to be cannon fire, and when he looked across to Morris Island and saw blue smoke drifting on the breeze, it confirmed his worst fears. He was soon being pestered by his officers and men for orders. Major Anderson, having not received the message from Washington which Governor Pickens' agent had intercepted, was unaware of his new authority, which allowed him to return fire in support of the steamer. He was still tied by his previous orders, which, as he interpreted them, meant he could not fire unless he was fired upon. He ordered the officers to join him in the garrison laundry, which doubled as a conference room. Once inside, they all tried to persuade Anderson that it was their duty to support the steamer with Sumter's guns. It was, after all, their flag that was being fired on, and reinforcements for the fort that the steamer was carrying. Anderson finally refused to issue such an order, saying, "Gentlemen, if I give you the order to support that steamer with our guns, it will mean war. I have not been officially informed that we are to be reinforced, and I have no written orders instructing me what action I can take in the case of a friendly vessel attempting such a mission. I refuse to take the responsibility of plunging the United States into a war with South Carolina unless we are fired upon directly ourselves. I'm sorry, I have not got a free hand in this matter. I refuse to go down in history as the man that inadvertently started what would amount to a civil war." The conference broke up. Captain Foster, as he returned to the parapet, was seen smashing his hat and muttering, "You might just as well let them trample on our flag." While Major Anderson held his conference, the battery on Morris Island had commenced firing again. Not warning shots this time. They intended to sink the steamer if they could. At first, their shot fell long. The inexperienced gunners were still using too much elevation, but they were quickly starting to correct. At the same time, the only gun on Fort Moultrie that had been remounted started to take ranging shots. The Star of the West was now in a crossfire, in which, once the gunners had found her range, she could be sunk in minutes. Her captain looked at Sumter through his glass. He could see the soldiers at their stations by their guns and wondered why they didn't do something to help him. The shots from Morris Island and Moultrie were slowly becoming more accurate. As the steamer closed with Sumter, huge spouts of white boiling water were erupting closer and closer to the paddle steamer. A lookout in the rigging shouted in alarm that there was a shot on the port side bouncing across the water towards the ship. The captain stepped to the bulwark and spotted the shot just before it smashed through the ship's planking just aft of the bow, narrowly missing a sailor. The captain shouted to one of his officers, ordering him to go and see what the damage was and to find out if there were any casualties. He then turned to Lieutenant Wood and apologized, explaining that he couldn't risk the lives of the crew and the lieutenant's men any longer. "Not while they just look on," he said, pointing at Sumter. The helmsman spun the wheel, and the ship started at once to answer to her helm, slowly turning to starboard in a tight circle away from the fort, and so back out to sea. Anderson had returned to the parapet to watch the brave steamer while it was still coming towards the fort. He saw the shot fired from the gun on Morris Island as it ricocheted across the water towards the steamer and smashed into her side near the bow. The gunners on the parapet near him turned to look at him, waiting for orders. They could not believe that he was going to let the secessionists fire on this friendly ship and do nothing about it. Anderson fought with his conscience as he watched the Star of the West, but the bookman's side of his personality won. His orders were clear. He could fire if fired upon, but he had no instructions for a case such as this. "Look, she's going about! She's turning!" shouted some of the men. Anderson looked through his glass. She was turning, still under fire, but she was starting to head back out to sea. Thank God, he thought. At least for today, a war had been prevented. Anderson gave instructions that most of his men could go to their quarters, leaving only 2 gunners on duty at each of the guns. He also requested that the officers should go to his quarters where he wished to see them. As the men started to stand down, the wife of one of the soldiers ran to a loaded gun trained on Morris Island and grabbed the lanyard. Captain Doubleday managed to pull her away just in time before she was able to fire it. She shouted, "Let me, Captain, let me! I will fire the gun if you men have not the courage."